Picture this: you're 23 years old, standing in a muddy field, clutching a rusted farm tool you've been told is now a weapon. Around you, thousands of men are screaming, some in languages you don't understand. The air smells like iron and fear. Your heart's hammering so hard you think it might actually burst through your ribs. This isn't a movie. There's no heroic music. No slow-motion cavalry charge with perfect lighting. This is a medieval battle, and it's about to get worse than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval warfare: most soldiers didn't die heroically. They died confused, terrified, often from infections days after the battle ended. They died because some lord they'd never met wanted a piece of land they'd never see. Tonight, we're stripping away every lie you've been told about medieval combat. And trust me, the truth is far more fascinating than the fantasy. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying this different take on history, the real, unfiltered version, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more content that actually respects your intelligence. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love seeing this community span the globe. Now, let's get into it. Let's start with how you ended up in this nightmare in the first place. And no, you probably didn't volunteer. See, in medieval times, most soldiers weren't professional warriors dreaming of glory on the battlefield. They were farmers, laborers, craftsmen. People who got a very unwelcome knock on their door one morning, and that knock changed everything. The man at your door was usually the local lord's bailiff, backed by a few armed guards. He wasn't there to ask politely. He was there to inform you that congratulations, you've been drafted. This was called feudal obligation, and it wasn't optional. If you were a peasant, and statistically, you absolutely were, you owed military service to your lord. It didn't matter if you had crops to harvest, children to feed, or zero interest in having your intestines decorating some foreign field. Your lord needed bodies for his army, and you were a body. The math was really that simple. Here's how the system worked. Every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 owed military service. In practice, bailiffs usually took men between 18 and 45, though those age limits got conveniently flexible when the war was going badly and bodies were scarce. Your local lord had a quota to fill for the king or the greater lord he served. If he needed 200 men, he was getting 200 men, one way or another. The bailiff would show up in your village with a list. Sometimes it was predetermined based on the lord's records. Sometimes it was more arbitrary: you, and you. Your opinion wasn't requested. Your circumstances didn't matter. Let's say you're a 30-year-old farmer named William. You've got a wife, 3 children, and 10 acres of land that keeps your family barely above starvation. It's late spring, and you're right in the middle of planting season. Miss this planting, and your family doesn't eat next winter. None of that matters. The bailiff reads your name from his list. You have 3 days to report to the assembly point with whatever weapon you can muster. Failure to appear equals desertion, and the penalty for desertion was severe. At minimum, you'd lose your land and your family would become destitute. At worst, hanging. Sometimes they'd do both, hang you and then confiscate your property just to make sure everyone got the message. You might be thinking, well, I'll just run away. Hide in the woods. Flee to another village where nobody knows me. Good luck with that. Medieval society was tight-knit in ways we can barely comprehend today. Everyone knew everyone, at least by reputation. Villages were small, usually fewer than 200 people. You couldn't vanish into anonymity because anonymity didn't really exist. And even if you could disappear, your family couldn't. Collective punishment was a cornerstone of medieval law enforcement. If you deserted, your wife might lose your land. Your children might be sold into servitude to pay the fine. Your parents, if they were still alive, might have their property seized. Your brothers might be conscripted in your place. The system was designed deliberately and efficiently to make sure you showed up. Because the consequences of running were worse than the consequences of fighting. At least in battle, you might survive. Desert, and you've condemned your entire family to ruin. So you report to the assembly point. You're not alone. Hundreds of other men are gathering, all of them wearing the same expression, fear poorly disguised as resignation. Some are your neighbors. Others come from villages you've barely heard of. You don't know them, yet you'll be expected to fight beside them, trust them with your life despite being complete strangers. The lucky ones, if you can call them that, were professional soldiers. Men at arms. Career warriors who'd been fighting since they were old enough to hold a sword. Mercenaries who sold their services to the highest bidder. These men made up maybe 5 to 10% of any given army. They had real training, real experience, real equipment. The rest? Peasant levies. Farmers who'd maybe held a spear once during village training exercises, which happened a few times a year and mostly involved drinking and hoping nobody noticed you weren't paying attention. Village military training was supposed to prepare you for this moment. In theory, every Sunday after church, able-bodied men were required to practice with weapons. In practice, it was a joke. The village had maybe 2 decent practice spears and 1 bow with a broken string. The training consisted of an elderly veteran, if your village was lucky enough to have one, showing you how to hold the spear and muttering something about keeping formation. Most of the training time was spent standing around while the Lord Sergeant yelled at everyone. Then you'd go to the tavern and try to forget that someday this pathetic excuse for preparation might be all that stood between you and a French pike. Well, that day has arrived. And you are catastrophically unprepared. Now let's talk about the army you're joining. Because medieval armies weren't uniform fighting forces. They were collections of retinues, each brought by a different noble, all awkwardly mashed together and told to cooperate. The king might have his household troops. Various dukes, earls, and barons brought their own men. Bishops sometimes contributed soldiers from church lands. Mercenary companies hired by whoever could afford them. All of these groups had different levels of training, different equipment, different levels of motivation, and sometimes completely different ideas about what they were even fighting for. Unity of command was theoretical at best. The nobles viewed you, the peasant levy, with barely concealed contempt. To them, you weren't really soldiers. You were mobile obstacles. Bodies to absorb arrows and fill out the battle line so it looked impressive from a distance. Some of these nobles were decent men who understood that peasant soldiers were human beings doing their duty. But many weren't. They saw you as livestock. Slightly more valuable than a horse, perhaps, but far less valuable than their hunting dogs. And here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough: criminals. Medieval armies included significant numbers of criminals offered pardons in exchange for military service. Empty the prisons, hand the inmates weapons, point them at the enemy. Problem solved. So you're standing in the assembly field, and next to you is Thomas, a farmer from the next village who seems nice enough. On your other side is a man with a nasty scar who was in jail for murder last week and is now your comrade in arms. Behind you is a teenager who looks like he's about to cry. In front of you is a grizzled veteran with 3 fingers missing who keeps muttering to himself. This is your army. These are the people you're trusting with your life. The gear you brought with you is pathetic. Most peasant levies showed up with farm tools that had been sharpened into weapons. A billhook for cutting crops, now repurposed for cutting men. A woodsman's axe. A hammer from your workshop. Maybe, if you were lucky, a rusty old sword that your grandfather claimed he took off a dead Frenchman, though really, he probably bought it from a traveling merchant who specialized in selling garbage to gullible peasants. Spears were the most common weapon for levies because they were cheap to make and relatively easy to use. Point the sharp end at the enemy, keep your distance, try not to die. That was basically the full extent of spear training. Armor? You're joking, right? Armor cost money. Real armor, mail, plate, anything that might actually stop a blade, cost more money than you'd see in 5 years of farming. A male shirt cost roughly what you could earn in 2 years if you saved every penny and your family somehow survived without your income. Plate armor. That was for nobility. You might as well wish for a castle and a dragon. So you wore what you could afford, which was almost nothing. A thick wool or leather tunic if you were lucky. Most men just wore their regular clothes, a linen shirt, wool tunic, maybe a leather jerkin if they worked in a trade that used one. Some men stuffed their shirts with straw or rags, creating a kind of improvised padding that would maybe, possibly, if God was feeling generous, slow down a knife. It wouldn't stop it, but slowing it down meant the difference between a survivable wound and a fatal one. The truly desperate wore cooking pots on their heads. I'm not exaggerating for effect. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts both mention men wearing whatever metal they could find as makeshift helmets. A soup pot tied to your skull with leather straps actually did provide some protection against glancing blows. It also made you look ridiculous, but looking ridiculous was better than having your skull split open. Some men fashioned helmets from boiled leather, cuir bouilli, leather soaked in hot water, shaped while soft, then allowed to harden. It was light, cheap, and provided minimal protection. Better than nothing. Barely. The wealthy peasants, the ones who owned more than the average 10 acres of land, might afford a padded jacket called a gambeson. Multiple layers of linen quilted together, stuffed with wool or old rags. A good gambeson could actually stop a weak blade strike or lessen the impact of a blow. But good gambesons were expensive, and most men's gambesons were homemade, poorly constructed affairs that fell apart after one battle. So there you stood. Clothed in rags. Armed with farm implements. About to face professional soldiers who'd been training for warfare since childhood. The odds were not in your favor. The assembly process took days. Men kept arriving from surrounding villages and towns. The professional soldiers, the men at arms, looked at each new group of peasant levies with undisguised disgust. You could see it in their faces. They knew most of you would be dead within a month, and they'd already written you off. The nobles on horseback didn't even look at you. You weren't worth noticing. And then came the worst part, the order to march. Medieval armies didn't teleport to the battlefield. They walked. For days. Weeks. Sometimes months. And this march, this seemingly boring part that movies always skip with a quick montage, killed more soldiers than combat ever did. Let's talk about what a medieval military march actually looked like, because this is where the reality of medieval warfare really hits home. First, the distance. Armies could be marching 50 to 200 miles or more to reach the battlefield. Some campaigns required even longer marches. The English army that fought at Crécy had marched through France for weeks before the battle. Crusader armies walked from Western Europe to the Holy Land, a journey of thousands of miles. A reasonably fit medieval army might cover 15 to 20 miles a day. That sounds manageable until you remember you're carrying everything you own, the roads are terrible, and you're already malnourished and probably sick. 7 to 10 hours of walking. Every single day. And what are you carrying? Your weapon, a spear, an axe, something heavy and awkward. Your bedroll, if you have one, which is really just a thin wool blanket that doesn't keep you warm. A sack with whatever food you've managed to scrounge, some stale bread, maybe a piece of dried meat if you're incredibly lucky. A water skin or leather bottle, hopefully full but probably not. Maybe a cooking pot. Perhaps a spare pair of shoes, though most men couldn't afford spares. That's 20 to 40 pounds of gear, minimum. For a modern soldier with proper equipment and nutrition, that's manageable. For a medieval peasant who's been living on the edge of malnutrition your entire life, it's brutal. Now factor in the terrain. Medieval roads were garbage. This cannot be overstated. The Romans had built magnificent roads, engineering marvels of stone and drainage. But the Romans had been gone for centuries, and their roads were falling apart, reclaimed by nature or repurposed by locals who stole the stones for building. Most of the time you're walking on dirt tracks that barely qualify as paths. When it's dry, they're rutted and uneven, full of rocks that turn your ankles and roots that trip you. When it rains, and it rains constantly because you're probably marching through northern Europe where the weather is determined to make you miserable, those dirt tracks turn into rivers of mud. Medieval mud wasn't like modern mud. This was thick, sucking, boot-stealing mud that could be ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes deeper. You'd step forward and your foot would sink, the mud grabbing your boot with obscene enthusiasm. Pulling your foot free required genuine effort. And sometimes your boot didn't come with it. You'd be walking along, step into a particularly nasty patch, and your boot would stay in the mud while your foot pulled free. Now, you had to decide, go back and dig your boot out, which meant stopping the entire column behind you and earning curses from everyone, or keep walking with one bare foot and figure it out later. Most men chose to retrieve the boot. Because walking barefoot on medieval roads was a fast track to infected feet. And infected feet meant you couldn't walk. And not being able to walk meant you got left behind. And getting left behind meant death. So you'd hop back on one foot, dig your hand into the cold wet mud, fish out your boot, which was now twice as heavy with mud inside it, dump out what you could, jam your wet foot back in, and hurry to catch up while the column kept moving. This happened multiple times per day. To everyone. Your shoes were falling apart. Medieval peasant shoes were not designed for military campaigns. They were thin leather affairs, sometimes just leather wrapped around your foot and tied with cord. After a few days of constant marching through mud and water, they'd start to disintegrate. The leather would crack. The stitching would come apart. The soles would separate from the uppers. You'd try to repair them at night using a needle and thread, if you had them. But leatherworking requires proper tools and dry conditions, neither of which you had. By the end of the first week, many men were walking in shoes held together by prayer and strips of cloth wrapped around them. By the second week, men were walking barefoot, their shoes having completely failed. Walking barefoot sounds bad in theory. In practice, it was a death sentence in slow motion. Your feet would develop blisters within hours. Those blisters would pop, leaving raw, open wounds. Those wounds would get infected because you're walking through mud, animal dung, human waste, and every kind of filth imaginable. Within days, your feet would be swollen, red, oozing pus. The infection would spread. Your lower legs would swell. Red streaks would appear, sepsis beginning. Without antibiotics, without proper treatment, that infection could kill you. Men died from foot infections during medieval marches. Not occasionally. Regularly. They'd start limping, then stumbling, then they couldn't walk at all. And they'd be left by the roadside because the army couldn't stop for one man with bad feet, and we haven't even talked about the biggest killer yet, disease. But first, let's talk about where you're sleeping each night. Because medieval military camps were hellscapes of filth and disease that would make a modern sewage treatment plant look pristine by comparison. Imagine thousands of men crammed into fields with zero sanitation infrastructure. No latrines. No organized waste disposal. No understanding of hygiene beyond, maybe don't eat the obviously rotten food. Where did men relieve themselves? Anywhere. Designated areas formed naturally, usually the edges of camp where men would go to shit and piss. But these weren't proper latrines. They were just areas where human waste accumulated in piles. The smell was beyond description. If you've ever smelled a portable toilet at a music festival in August, multiply that by 1,000 and you're getting close. The stench of thousands of men's waste, rotting in the sun, mixing with the mud, attracted flies in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. And the waste was everywhere. Not just in the latrine areas. At night, in the dark, men would stumble a few feet from where they slept and relieve themselves right there. In the morning, you might wake up to find that someone had shit right next to where your head had been resting. The camp spread disease like nothing else. Dysentery spread rapidly. This wasn't the mild food poisoning you might experience today. Medieval dysentery meant you'd be shitting liquid 20, 30, 40 times a day. You'd lose massive amounts of fluid and electrolytes. Dehydration would set in fast. Your mouth would be dry, your eyes sunken, your skin loose and papery. The pain was constant. Stomach cramps that doubled you over. Burning as the acidic liquid tore at your already raw anus. Blood in your stool, which meant the intestinal lining was being destroyed. You'd try to keep marching because stopping meant being left behind. But eventually you couldn't. You'd collapse, lying in your own filth, too weak to move while the army marched past you. Dysentery killed thousands upon thousands of medieval soldiers. During some campaigns, up to 30 or 40% of the army died from disease before ever reaching the enemy. Then there were the lice. Everyone had lice. These weren't modern, relatively rare lice. These were medieval lice, and they were everywhere. In your hair, in your beard if you had one, in your clothes, in your bedding. They lived in the seams of your garments, laying eggs by the hundreds. Lice bites itch constantly. You'd be scratching all day, every day. The scratching would break the skin, creating entry points for infection. And worse, lice carried typhus, a disease that killed millions during medieval times. Typhus started with a severe headache and high fever. Then came a rash, starting on your trunk and spreading outward. Then delirium, confusion, organ failure, death. Once typhus got into an army, it spread like wildfire because everyone had lice and everyone was in close contact. You'd see men develop the fever and everyone would back away from them, knowing what was coming. The sick man would be delirious within days, raving, not recognizing anyone. Then he'd collapse and die, usually within a week or two of the first symptoms. The body would be left by the roadside. Nobody had time or energy for proper burial. The army marched on, and the corpse stayed behind, food for scavengers. The camp followers made everything more complicated. Every medieval army dragged along a massive tail of non-combatants. These weren't just wives and prostitutes, though there were plenty of both. There were merchants selling overpriced food and equipment, blacksmiths offering to repair weapons and armor, priests hearing confessions and offering spiritual comfort, surgeons ready to saw off limbs, opportunistic thieves waiting to rob anyone who looked vulnerable. These camp followers could outnumber the actual soldiers. For every fighting man, there might be one or two non-combatants trailing along. The prostitutes were a major presence. Medieval armies attracted sex workers like battlefields attracted crows. These women, and sometimes young men, followed the army from place to place, offering their services to soldiers who had coin and wanted temporary comfort before possibly dying. The conditions these sex workers lived in were appalling. They had no protection, no rights, no recourse if soldiers became violent. They were often treated as subhuman, beaten, robbed, sometimes killed. And they spread disease. Gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted infections were rampant. Soldiers would visit the camp prostitutes, contract infections, and then suffer for weeks with painful urination, discharge, and sores. Other parts of the body. At night, the camp became even worse. Fires burned everywhere, creating a landscape of flickering shadows and smoke. Men gambled, fighting over dice and cards, sometimes killing each other over disputed games. Drunkenness was common because alcohol was one of the few pleasures available. The drinking led to fights. Not playful scuffles, but genuine violence. Men would beat each other half to death over insults, over gambling debts, over women, over nothing at all. And through it all, you're trying to prepare mentally for battle, knowing that in a day or two, you're going to be expected to stand in a line and fight trained killers. This is the night nobody talks about in the legends. No songs are sung about the evening before the battle, when thousands of men collectively realize they're probably going to die. No tapestries depict the terror, the desperate prayers, the quiet sobbing in the darkness. But this night was real. And for medieval soldiers, it was often worse than the battle itself. Let's start with the confessions. Medieval soldiers were genuinely, deeply religious in ways modern people struggle to understand. They believed in God, in heaven and hell, in the very real possibility that dying without absolution meant eternal damnation. The fear of hell was as real and immediate as the fear of the enemy army. So before every major battle, priests moved through the camp hearing confessions. The lines were long, hundreds of men waiting their turn to whisper their sins to a priest they'd probably never see again. The confessions were heartbreaking. Men would confess to adultery, to stealing from their neighbors, to hating their lords, to doubting God during moments of despair. They'd confess to sins both great and small, desperate to clear their souls before they died. Some men hadn't been to confession in years. They'd accumulated so many sins that the confession took hours. The priest would listen patiently, occasionally asking questions, trying to understand the depth of the spiritual burden this man was carrying. The priests granted absolution mechanically. After a while, they couldn't maintain emotional engagement with hundreds of identical confessions. Say 10 Our Fathers, 5 Hail Marys, and go in peace. Your sins are forgiven. Next man. But for the soldiers, this absolution was everything. Knowing that their souls were clean, that if they died tomorrow they'd go to heaven, provided the only real comfort available. Some men couldn't wait for a priest. They confessed to each other, to their friends, sobbing and asking forgiveness for old grudges and petty arguments. Friendships that had been strained were suddenly mended because nobody wanted to die with bad blood between them. You'd see grown men embracing, crying, telling each other things they'd never said before. I've always respected you. You're the best friend I've ever had. I'm sorry for that time I stole your bread. The intensity of emotion was overwhelming. Mass was held in the evening. Thousands of men knelt in the muddy fields as priests elevated the host, blessing the army, promising that God favored their cause, that dying in battle was dying for God. The priests would give sermons about the righteousness of the war. The enemy were heretics, or invaders, or godless men who deserved to die. Your cause was just. God was watching. Fight well and heaven awaited. Both sides did this, of course. Both armies had priests promising that God was on their side. Nobody mentioned the logical impossibility of this, or if they did, they didn't mention it loudly. After the religious ceremonies came the practical preparations. You checked your weapon again. And again. And again. You'd already checked it 100 times, but you couldn't stop. You'd run your finger along the blade, testing the sharpness. You'd flex the shaft, making sure it wasn't cracked. You'd adjust the grip, wrap it with extra cloth to prevent slipping. This wasn't about the weapon needing checking. It was about doing something, anything, to keep your mind occupied and your hands busy. Because if you stopped, if you sat still and let your thoughts run free, the fear would overwhelm you. Some men tried to eat, but food turned to ash in their mouths. The body knows when it's in danger, and digestion becomes a low priority. Soldiers before battle often couldn't keep food down. They'd force themselves to eat a piece of bread, and minutes later they'd be vomiting it back up. The smell of vomit mixed with the existing stench of the camp. Men were throwing up from anxiety all around you, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. Some men wrote letters home, if they were literate. Most weren't. Medieval peasants couldn't read or write. So they found a scribe or a clerk, someone who could write, and dictated messages. Tell my wife I love her. Make sure the children know I thought of them at the end. Tell them to be good, to work hard, to remember me. The scribes would write these words down, knowing that most of these letters would never be delivered. The man dictating would probably die tomorrow, and his letter would be lost, stolen, or destroyed. Others tried to sleep, knowing they desperately needed rest, but finding it impossible. You'd lie on the ground, staring at the stars, listening to the sounds of thousands of other men who also couldn't sleep. Coughing. Praying. weeping quietly in the darkness. The fear was a physical thing. It sat in your stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. Your hands shook. Your heart raced. You'd feel like you couldn't get enough air, like you were suffocating even though you were outside under an open sky. Some men shit themselves from terror, unable to control their bowels. This was common enough that nobody made fun of it. Everyone understood. Everyone was terrified. Morning came too soon. You were woken by shouted commands, drums, horns. You got up, every muscle aching, joint stiff, feeling worse than when you'd lain down. Breakfast, if there was any, was a piece of stale bread and some questionable water. Then you started forming up. Forming a medieval battle line was less like an orderly military maneuver and more like herding terrified cats into a formation that vaguely resembled an army. Commands were shouted in multiple languages, none of which half the army understood. Form up. Get in line. Move, you bastards. Sergeants and veteran soldiers physically shoved men into position, screaming at anyone who hesitated, using the butts of spears or their fists to move people faster. You stumbled into your place in the formation, surrounded by men you barely knew. Your heart was hammering so hard you could hear it in your ears, louder than the shouts, louder than the drums. The professional soldiers, the men at arms, took positions at the front and flanks where the real fighting would happen. They were calm, or at least appeared calm, checking their weapons with practiced efficiency. The peasant levies, were packed into the charges while the professionals did the actual fighting. The spacing was claustrophobic. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping when they had shields. This was intentional. A tight formation was harder to break. But it also meant you couldn't move. You were locked in place by the bodies around you, unable to advance or retreat without everyone else moving too. The smell was overwhelming. Thousands of unwashed bodies packed tight, sweating with fear. The smell of the camp, shit, rot, smoke, clung to everyone. Some men had already pissed themselves. Others were vomiting from terror, the sick splashing onto the muddy ground. You could hear men praying around you. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, the words tumbled out in desperate whispers, over and over, a lifeline to cling to. Across the field, maybe 300 to 500 yards away, the enemy was forming their own line. From this distance, they were just a dark, shifting mass. You couldn't see individual faces, just a wall of men bristling with weapons, waiting to kill you. War drums began their rhythmic pounding. Boom. 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 The sound was designed to keep men moving in sync and to strike fear into the enemy. The vibrations traveled through the ground, through your body, merging with your own frantic heartbeat. And then came the command everyone had been dreading. Advance. The line lurched forward. Moving thousands of men forward in anything resembling a formation was nearly impossible, but somehow, through shouting and shoving and the sheer momentum of the mass, the line began to advance. You walked forward, step by step, trying to keep pace with the men around you. The ground was uneven, churned by previous armies, scarred by old campsites. You stumbled over roots, rocks, the charred remains of fires. Your mouth was dry despite the ale you drunk that morning. Your tongue felt thick, stuck to the roof of your mouth. You tried to swallow but couldn't. The distance closed. 300 yards. 200. 100. As you got closer, the archers on both sides began their work. The English longbowmen, if your army had them, were devastating. These men had trained with bows since childhood, developing the massive shoulder and back muscles required to pull a 150-pound draw weight. The sound of a mass archery barrage is distinctive. First, the creaking of hundreds of bowstrings being drawn. Then the simultaneous release, a sound like a giant's exhale. Then the hiss and whistle of arrows in flight, filling the air with a sound like wind through trees, but sharper, more malevolent. You watched the arrows arc into the sky from your side, a dark cloud rising and then beginning to descend toward the enemy. For a moment they seemed to hang, suspended, blotting out the sun. Then they fell. And then their archers returned fire. You saw the arrows rising from their side, a dark cloud growing larger, coming toward you. For a split second, some distant part of your brain thought, "That's beautiful," in a disconnected, dreamlike way. Then the arrows arrived, and beauty became nightmare. The sound was everywhere at once. Arrows hitting shields with solid thunks. Arrows punching through leather and wool with wet tearing sounds. Arrows hitting men. The man 3 ranks ahead of you took an arrow through the throat. You saw it happen. One moment he was walking forward, gripping his spear. The next, a yard-long shaft was protruding from his neck, blood spraying in arterial spurts, painting the men around him red. He made a sound you'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. Not a scream, not a gasp, just a wet gurgling noise as he tried to breathe through a throat full of blood. He fell to his knees, hands clutching at the arrow, trying to pull it free but only making it worse. Then he fell forward, twitching, and the men behind him stepped over his body and kept walking. Because stopping meant dying right here. The distance closed. 50 yards. 40. 30. The front ranks lowered their spears, a wall of wooden shafts pointing forward, forming a bristling hedge of death. You weren't in the front, thank God, but you could see what was coming. 20 yards. Both sides were sprinting now, the walk breaking into a run. The lines accelerated toward each other like waves rushing to collision. 10 yards. 5. The noise was beyond description. Screaming, drums, the thunder of thousands of feet hitting the ground simultaneously. 3 yards. 2. And then, with a sound like the world breaking, the lines crashed together. The moment of impact was indescribable. Imagine a car crash, but instead of metal and glass, it's thousands of human bodies slamming into each other at full sprint. The front ranks collided with a noise that was part crunch, part scream, part something worse. Spears thrust forward, seeking gaps in the enemy formation. Shields slammed together with impacts that sent shockwaves through both lines. Men were knocked backward, knocked down, crushed between the two walls of humanity. You weren't in the very front, but the impact hit you anyway. The men ahead stopped suddenly as they crashed into the enemy, and you slammed into them from behind. Everyone behind you crashed into you. Suddenly you were part of a massive human press, crushed between layers of bodies, unable to move, barely able to breathe. This was the reality of medieval melee combat. It wasn't Hollywood dueling. It wasn't one-on-one fights with room to maneuver. It was a shoving match where thousands of pounds of human weight pushed from both sides, and the men caught in the middle were crushed, stabbed, or trampled. The front rank was dying. You couldn't see it clearly, but you could hear it. Screams. Wet thuds. The sound of metal on flesh. Spears thrust over and over into the packed enemy formation. There was no room to dodge, no space to parry. You just took the hit or you didn't. The ground became a nightmare within minutes. Blood mixed with mud, creating a slick paste the color and consistency of liver. Bodies of the dead and wounded carpeted the earth, turning the battlefield into a treacherous landscape of corpses. You were walking on them, stepping on them, using them for footing because the mud was too slippery otherwise. You'd step forward and your boot would land on something soft, a stomach, a face, a hand. The body would shift under your weight, making you stumble. Sometimes the bodies underneath weren't dead. They'd grab at your legs, trying to pull themselves up or trying to pull you down with them in their death throes. You'd kick them away or step on their heads to maintain balance, because stopping meant falling, and falling in this press meant being trampled to death. This went on for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably 20 minutes to an hour of sustained close combat. But in that time, you lived 1,000 lifetimes of terror. And then, somewhere in the chaos, something shifted. Medieval battles weren't won by killing every single enemy soldier. They were won when one side's morale shattered and the formation collapsed into panic. Unmistakable. You felt it before you saw it. A change in the pressure. A shift in the sounds around you. The relentless push forward would falter. The battle cries would turn into something else, fear, desperation, then panic. It might start with a banner falling. The king's standard or a great lord's colors would go down, and men would think their leader was dead. Word would spread through the ranks faster than wildfire. The king is down. The king is dead. We're lost. Sometimes it was simpler. A section of the line would give ground, just a few feet, but that movement would ripple outward. Men would look around and see their neighbors backing up, and they'd back up too. A fighting withdrawal would become a retreat. A retreat would become a rout. When the break came, it was swift and terrible. Someone at the back would turn and run. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. The formation would dissolve like salt in water, men throwing down their weapons and sprinting for their lives. This was the rout. And this was when the real killing began. You see, fighting an organized enemy who's facing you, shields up, weapons ready, that's hard. That's dangerous. You might die. But chasing down terrified men who've thrown away their weapons and are running in blind panic? That's easy. That's safe. That's sport. The cavalry, which had been waiting for exactly this moment, charged. War horses trained to run down fleeing men thundered across the field. Knights with lances lowered caught runners in the back, the impact lifting men off their feet and hurling them aside like broken dolls. The sound of cavalry hitting a routing formation was distinctive. The drum of hooves building to thunder. Then the wet impacts as lances found flesh. The screaming of horses and men. The grinding sound of heavy riders trampling bodies into the mud. Foot soldiers pursued on foot, chasing down anyone slower or more wounded. A man stumbling on an injured leg didn't make it far. Neither did anyone exhausted from the fight, which was everyone. The killing was methodical and one-sided. Catch a fleeing man, stab him in the back, move to the next one. No honor. No glory. Just slaughter. Let's say you survived the battle itself, the melee, the rout, the immediate slaughter. Congratulations. Now let's talk about your wounds, and why you probably wish you died quickly. Medieval combat left injuries that were horrifying even by modern standards. And medieval medicine was, to put it charitably, inadequate. First, understand that in the chaos of melee, you didn't get clean wounds. You got hacked, stabbed, crushed, and mangled. Weapons didn't slice neatly through flesh like in movies. They tore it, shattered bone, and left ragged wounds that bled profusely. A sword cut to your arm wouldn't be a thin line. It would be a gaping wound, muscles severed, tendons cut, bone possibly fractured or split. The edges would be rough, torn, impossible to stitch together properly even if you had proper surgeons. Which you didn't. A spear thrust to your abdomen would puncture internal organs, your stomach, your intestines, your liver. The blade would carry dirt and fabric into the wound, contaminating everything it touched. Even if the spear missed vital organs, the internal bleeding and infection would probably kill you anyway. A mace blow to your head would fracture your skull, causing bleeding in your brain. You might seem fine for hours or even days, then suddenly collapse as pressure built inside your skull. Or you might survive but with permanent brain damage, unable to speak clearly, walk straight, or remember your own name. And there was no anesthesia. No antibiotics. No understanding of germs or infection. No proper surgical instruments. The battlefield after combat was hell on earth. Thousands of wounded men lay scattered across the churned mud, screaming, crying, begging for help that mostly wouldn't come. If you were a knight or noble, you had a chance. Your retainers would search for you among the bodies, recognize your armor or heraldry, and carry you to safety. A surgeon would be summoned. You might survive. If you were a common soldier, you lay where you fell. Maybe a friend would drag you to the edge of the field if you were lucky. Maybe not. You might lie there for hours, bleeding, watching the sun move across the sky, wondering if you were going to die alone. The camp followers descended on the battlefield like carrion birds. They moved among the wounded and dead, robbing them systematically. Weapons, armor, clothes, coins, anything of value was stripped from men too injured to resist. Some of these scavengers would kill the wounded to make looting easier. A knife to the throat was quick and practical. They weren't being especially cruel, just efficient. A dying man couldn't object to having his boots stolen. Eventually, if you were lucky, the army surgeons would arrive. But medieval surgeons were barely qualified by any reasonable standard. Their training consisted mainly of apprenticeship to other surgeons, learning by trial and error. The tools were primitive and terrifying. Bone saws for amputating limbs. Cauterizing irons heated in campfires. Crude forceps for pulling arrows out of flesh. All of it caked with blood and filth from previous patients, because sterilization hadn't been invented yet. Arrow wounds were particularly problematic. If the arrow had gone completely through your body, the surgeon might push it the rest of the way out, tearing a larger exit wound. If it was stuck, they'd have to pull it back out, dragging the barbed head through flesh and muscle while you screamed. Amputation was common. A mangled limb, especially if bone was shattered beyond repair, couldn't be saved. The surgeon would tie a leather tourniquet above the wound, place your arm or leg on a wooden block, and saw through bone and muscle as quickly as possible. You'd be held down by several men while this happened. No drugs. No alcohol strong enough to dull the pain significantly. You'd feel the saw teeth biting into your bone, the vibration traveling up through your body, the wet tearing as flesh separated. The pain was beyond human description. Men would pass out from shock, which was a mercy. Those who stayed conscious would scream until their voices gave out, then continue screaming silently, mouth open, no sound emerging. When the limb was severed, the stump would be cauterized with a red-hot iron to seal the blood vessels. The smell of your own flesh cooking would fill your nostrils. The searing pain of the hot metal would somehow be worse than the amputation itself. If you survived the surgery, and many didn't, you still had to survive the aftermath. Every battlefield wound was contaminated. The weapons that caused them were filthy, covered in rust, dirt, and the blood of previous victims. The ground you'd been lying on was full of bacteria from human and animal waste. The surgeon's unwashed hands introduced more contamination. Within hours or days, infection would set in. The wound would become red, swollen, hot to the touch. Infection spread through your lymphatic system. Gangrene was the worst. The flesh around your wound would turn black, then green, then fall away in rotting chunks. The smell was indescribable, sweet, putrid, the unmistakable scent of death while you were still alive. The gangrene would spread. First the immediate area around the wound, then outward, consuming healthy tissue. You'd watch your own body rot while you were still using it, the battle was won or lost. Either way, the army was disbanding, and you were expected to find your own way home. For the knights and nobles, this was straightforward. They had horses, retinues, money for inns and food. They'd ride home in relative comfort, their war stories already being polished for future tellings. For you, the common soldier, getting home was another ordeal that might kill you after you'd somehow survived everything else. First, you had to figure out where you were. Medieval soldiers often had only the vaguest idea of geography beyond their immediate local area. You'd been marched for weeks through unfamiliar territory, fought a battle somewhere that might not even have a proper name, and now you were expected to navigate hundreds of miles back to your village. The wounds you'd taken in battle were still with you. That cut on your arm from a sword blade, still infected, red and swollen, weeping pus that stained your clothes. That blow to the ribs from a warhammer, probably a fracture that sent shooting pains through your chest every time you breathed deeply. You were traveling while injured, with no medical care, through territory that ranged from indifferent to actively hostile. Every step was painful. Every mile was an achievement. Food was scarce. The army supply system, such as it was, no longer existed. You had to forage, beg, or steal food to survive. Foraging meant eating whatever you could find, berries, nuts, roots, grass if you were desperate enough. Most of it was inadequate nutrition for a man trying to walk 20 miles a day. Begging meant approaching villages and farms, asking for charity. Sometimes it worked. Christian duty demanded feeding the hungry, and some people took that seriously. But most villagers had been raided and robbed by soldiers so many times that they viewed any armed man as a threat. Stealing was risky but sometimes necessary. You could take food from fields or orchards, but if you were caught, local justice was swift and brutal. Peasants would beat thieves to death with farming tools or hand them over to local authorities who would hang them without trial. Your plunder, if you'd managed to acquire any, made you a target. Other soldiers, your former comrades, would rob you if they thought you had something valuable. The bonds of fellowship that had existed during the campaign dissolved the moment the army disbanded. You couldn't trust anyone. That man from the next village over who'd fought beside you in the shield wall. He'd cut your throat for a decent sword or a purse of coins. Bandits watched the road specifically for disbanded soldiers. They knew veterans would be carrying weapons, armor, possibly loot from the battlefield. Groups of brigands would ambush individual soldiers or small groups, killing them and taking everything. The smart approach was to travel in larger groups, but large groups moved slowly and attracted attention. Small groups moved faster but were vulnerable to attack. Traveling alone was fastest but essentially suicidal. You had to sleep rough every night. Inns existed, but they were expensive and often wouldn't accept common soldiers anyway. Innkeepers had learned that soldiers meant trouble, fighting, drinking, inability to pay, theft. Most would turn you away at the door. So you slept wherever you smell of a battlefield to people who think the worst odor they'll encounter is the pigsty. The village hadn't changed. The same houses. The same fields. The same petty gossip about who was sleeping with whom and which family had the best harvest. The problems that had seemed important when you left, boundary disputes, unpaid debts, social rivalries, now felt meaningless. You'd watched thousands of men die for causes they didn't understand. You'd survived battles that would be talked about for generations. And now people wanted to discuss whether the miller was charging fair prices for grain. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be named for centuries, but medieval soldiers absolutely suffered from it. The symptoms were identical to what modern veterans experience, but without any understanding of what was happening or any effective treatment. You couldn't sleep without nightmares. The battle would replay in your mind with vivid clarity. You'd relive the moment when the lines crashed together, the sounds of men dying, the feeling of your spear punching through human flesh. You'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, sometimes screaming. Loud noises would send you into panic. A door slamming sounded like shields clashing. Thunder reminded you of cavalry charges. The sound of metal on metal, a blacksmith working, someone sharpening a blade, would make you flinch and reach for weapons you no longer carried. You'd developed hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats that didn't exist. In crowds, you'd position yourself where you could see all the exits. You'd sit with your back to walls. You'd wake up multiple times each night, listening for sounds that might indicate danger. Your temper had changed. Little things would enrage you. A spilled drink. A crying child. Someone walking too close behind you. You'd been living with constant threat for so long that normal life felt wrong, unsafe. You'd lash out at your family, unable to explain why you were so angry all the time. The work you'd done before the war, farming, carpentry, whatever trade you'd practiced, was either impossible or unbearable. If you'd lost fingers or a hand, physical labor was out of the question. Even if you were physically intact, you found it hard to care about anything. Planting crops seemed pointless when you'd seen entire armies die for nothing. Building furniture felt trivial after surviving battles that decided the fate of kingdoms. Your relationship with God had changed. You'd prayed desperately for survival, made bargains with saints, watched priests promise that God favored your cause while identical priests on the other side made identical promises to your enemies. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Drinking helped, when you could afford it. Alcohol could numb the memories, quiet the nightmares, make the world seem bearable for a few hours. Many veterans became heavy drinkers, spending whatever money they had on ale or wine, trying to forget what couldn't be forgotten. The community treated you differently now. You were marked, changed, no longer quite one of them. Parents didn't want their children playing too close to your house. Women avoided making eye contact. Even the church seemed uncomfortable with you, as if the violence you'd participated in, however justified, had stained your soul. People were afraid of veterans. And for good reason. You'd been trained to kill. You'd done it. That knowledge was written in your posture, your eyes, the way you moved through the world. Years would pass. The immediate trauma would fade slightly, though never completely. You'd learn to manage the nightmares, to control the anger, to function in civilian life despite everything you'd been through. But you'd never be the same man who'd left the village that day when the bailiff came calling. That person was gone, left behind on a battlefield whose name you might not even remember clearly. Medieval veterans carried their wars with them forever. So there it is. What actually happened in a medieval battle? From the moment some lord's bailiff knocked on your door to drag you from your fields, through the nightmare of campaign life, to the horror of combat itself, and finally to the long, painful aftermath that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit our fantasies about the past. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't honorable. It wasn't romantic or exciting or any of the things Hollywood has convinced us medieval warfare was like. It was terrifying, painful, disgusting, and traumatic in ways that would break most modern people within days. You didn't die heroically in single combat with a worthy opponent while stirring music played in the background. You died crushed in a press of bodies, stabbed from behind by someone you never saw, or you survived the battle only to die days later from an infected wound while lying in your own filth. You didn't fight for noble causes or grand ideals. You fought because refusing meant death, and even accepting meant probable death, but at least the social pressure made the choice feel inevitable. The reality of medieval warfare was that common soldiers were expendable resources in conflicts that didn't concern them. They were human ammunition fired at enemy formations and considered acceptable losses by commanders who never risked their own lives in the front ranks. You weren't a hero in some grand narrative. You were a victim of a social system that treated human life as cheap and disposable, especially if that life belonged to someone poor, uneducated, and powerless. And yet somehow, they did it. Thousands upon thousands of medieval soldiers, conscripted against their will, marched to battlefields across Europe and beyond. They fought because the alternatives were worse. They survived when they could, died when they couldn't. Their courage wasn't the courage of stories, the brave knight facing down overwhelming odds to save the kingdom. It was something more fundamental and more tragic. The courage to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when you knew where the road led. This was real courage. Not the flashy, dramatic kind that makes for good entertainment, but the quiet, desperate kind that lets people endure the unendurable because they have no choice. We owe it to those forgotten soldiers to remember the truth. Not because it makes us feel good, but because forgetting dishonors their memory. The next time you watch a medieval battle scene in a movie or read about glorious warfare in a historical novel, remember this: every person in that scene represents someone real who experienced something far worse than any filmmaker would dare to show. Someone with a family. Dreams. Fears. Someone who probably didn't want to be there and who paid a terrible price for being forced to participate in someone else's war. That's the real history. That's what actually happened in a medieval battle. Thanks for sticking with this journey through one of history's darkest and most misunderstood realities. If you made it all the way through, you now know something most people don't, the truth behind the legends. Take care of yourselves out there. And sleep well, knowing that you'll never have to experience what those medieval soldiers went through. Their wars are over. Their suffering is done. But their memory deserves to live on, honestly told. Good night.